filled with the sound of the end credits for Contact. You guys, I cannot.
I can't believe on my daughter's birthday.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime. It's Crue Trime, isn't it? My name is Sarah, and I am here today to tell you a terrible story to ruin your day. And put on my makeup at the same time. So if you are into chaos, crime, and concealer, you're in the right place. So subscribe, ring the bell, do all the things. So before we dive in, I need to give a huge shout out to the person who recommended this week's story. Nashi, this one is for you. You have officially ruined my week with a story about a man who faked the worst British accent ever. Still ended up in jail. Chef's kiss recommendation. So let's get right into it. This is the story of Nicholas Alahverdian. Picture it, December 2021. Glasgow, Scotland. A man was rushed to the hospital with a bad case of the vid. He sat in a wheelchair, he could barely breathe, and he introduced himself as Arthur Knight. He wore an oxygen mask, silk pajamas, and he spoke in an accent that sounded like if Hugh Grant and Dracula had a baby that was raised by Mrs. Doubtfire. It's so bad. The nurses at the hospital, bless them, they were squinting. This guy's accent was like obviously super fake. He was so over the top, you know, like soap opera style. But you know what? There's a lot of weird people out there, so whatever. But this guy wasn't just weird. He was weird and also could not produce any like identification documents or medical records. So when the nurses started doing the math on him, it seemed like a good idea to kind of contact the authorities just in case. So the police checked into it and, you know, they just assumed it was probably some weirdo. But some of the descriptions that were provided on this person, like tattoos, you know, distinct markings on this person's body, it ended up matching this Interpol red notice about a fugitive from the United States. So they compared the tattoos, mugshots from the system, and biometrics from the hospital, and bingo bango. Arthur Knight was on the run from criminal charges in the United States. And his name, no surprise, was not Arthur Knight. This was Nicholas Alahverdian, or one of his 9 aliases. But that's not even the weirdest part of the story. Who the F was Nicholas Alahverdian? I'm glad you asked. Nicholas Alahverdian was born on July 11th, 1987 in Rhode Island. His mother, Kathy, was also a Rhode Island native, but I didn't really find much about his dad, except that he was of Armenian descent and largely absent. Kathy later remarried a man named David Rossi, and Nicholas claimed that David was abusive. Was he? It doesn't seem so, but Nicholas was very troubled. In his youth, he struggled with behavioral and mental health issues, and he was diagnosed with ADD and narcissistic personality disorder. His mother really tried to give him the resources he needed to help him. You know, he went to treatment centers and therapies, but he was so volatile in their home that he ended up being placed in the care of Rhode Island's Department of Children, Youth, and Families night-to-night program for troubled children. So Nicholas was not an only child. He had siblings, including at least one younger brother, but also don't have a lot of information about them because they largely stayed very purposefully out of public eye. But the point is, Nicholas and his struggles just made life in the home unbearable. So while his siblings grew up with some semblance of stability and normal family life, Nicholas bounced through group homes and troubled youth camps to deal with his issues. Now later, he would spin this as evidence that he alone had survived some brutal foster care system where he suffered physical abuse and mistreatment, which there are no records. And let's be real, okay? Nicholas loved nothing more than painting himself as this like tragic chosen one. So by 2002, at just 14 years old, Nicholas snagged a page job at the Rhode Island State House in Providence. He was ambitious, eager, and armed with this backstory tailor-made to win sympathy. Now, the politicians that he worked with described him as bright but troubled. And Nicholas soaked up all the attention. He charmed these lawmakers with this "I survived foster care" story, and one of the representatives was actually so touched with his story that he wanted to formally adopt him. But the family court judge warned him not to. This judge had actually been involved in much of Nicholas's family issues, and he knew exactly who this kid was. You know, a master manipulator, charmer, storyteller, and human wrecking ball. In 2006, Nicholas graduated from St. Patrick's Academy, which is a small Catholic high school in Providence. By then, he had already started rehearsing the 2 roles that he'd play for the rest of his life: tragic foster care survivor and opportunistic manipulator. So after graduation, Nicholas decided to start using his stepdad's surname, Rossi. He drifted between Rhode Island, Ohio, and Utah. In 2008, he began attending Utah State University in Logan, Utah, and he presented himself the way he always did. You know, smart, polished, and special, leaning on this survivor story to impress people, and that included young women that he met on MySpace. And for the youngs, which I don't think there are any young people watching this channel. Anyways, you might not remember, MySpace was like the precursor to Facebook. Anyway, so Nicholas met one young woman on MySpace. They chatted online for a short time, you know, a few weeks maybe, and she found him articulate and sensitive and smart. You know, the same image that he always tried to sell. When they decided to finally meet in person, it didn't go well. So essentially, Nicholas tried to put on the moves, and the girl was not into it. But Nicholas got violent. He overpowered her. He sexually assaulted her. The woman went to the police right away, and a sexual assault kit was administered. You know, evidence was collected and preserved, and the case eventually went cold. The DNA evidence just kind of sat there on ice. Now, I'm not sure how or why she didn't press charges. I mean, she went and had the rape kit done, but like, it's just sort of like muddy and unclear. Like, did she not have his real name? It sounds like it. So Nicholas, meanwhile, just carried on like nothing happened, and he left Utah. He went back east. He bounced around Rhode Island, being a general menace, harassing women, getting the cops called on him a lot, until he finally settled in Ohio, and he enrolled at Sinclair Community College in Dayton. Then he later transferred to Wright State University. So on November 5th, 2010, Nicholas married a Canadian woman, and this marriage was quite short-lived and shitty, you know. They split less than a year after they were married, and he was physically abusive, manipulative, and terrible with money. Their divorce papers described him as controlling and cruel. This was an early red flag, though not his last trip down the aisle. In October of 2015, Nicholas had tied the knot again. They had met at a singles mixer at a local LDS church. You know, smooth-talking Nicholas told her that he was a Mormon, which was a lie. That marriage also imploded quickly. She accused him of fraud, coercion, and stealing her money. She filed for a protective order against him, saying he was dangerous and manipulative. Within 7 months of saying "I do," Nicholas had emptied out their house and their bank account and ran off to Rhode Island. This guy was a menace. So Nicholas left Ohio in shambles. He ran back to Rhode Island using his original last name at this time, Alahverdian. Lawsuits stacked up against him for unpaid debts, for credit cards, personal loans, and rent. He owed tens of thousands of dollars. He had multiple judgments against him by 2012, and at one point he even filed for bankruptcy. So Nicholas had stacked up 2 failed marriages, a bunch of protective orders, and a trail of unpaid debts. But instead of slowing down, he decided to reinvent himself again. This time, he founded a nonprofit group that he called the Children's Crusade for Reform. I mean, on paper, it sounded noble. Nicholas, this self-proclaimed survivor of the broken foster care system, was now launching a grassroots campaign to protect other kids from what he claimed happened to him.
I chose to fight for the rights of myself as a kid in DCYF care and fight for the rights of those who were actually beating me up.
Now he's behind 3 bills that are endorsed by several lawmakers. One would overhaul DCYF. In other words, stop Rhode Island from sending children out of state.
He told donors and lawmakers that the crusade would advocate for child welfare reform, lobby legislators and improve oversight. It's all a great idea, and there are plenty of children, unfortunately, who are suffering in the foster care system. The problem is, Nicholas didn't suffer any of that. He had mental illness and was just kind of an asshole. Nobody was abusing him. He just wasn't getting what he wanted. Well, as much good as the Children's Crusade could do, it was a scam itself. It was basically just Nicholas with a website and a PayPal account.
A lie.
There was no staff, no programs, no infrastructure. Nicholas was the president, the treasurer, and probably the intern too. Donors gave money thinking that they were helping vulnerable kids, But court records later showed that the money went to Nicholas and his personal expenses.
Cause I ain't got no money. And you gonna give me the money you got.
Landlords sued him for unpaid rent. Vendors sued him for unpaid invoices. And even volunteers accused him of manipulation. What Nicholas was crusading for was Nicholas.
Unforgivable.
This non-profit was like a shell to fund his lifestyle and prop up his image as this great reformer. And it worked, for a little while. Nobody's quick to challenge somebody who seems like they have good intentions, right? The Children's Crusade got him airtime, on local TV, newspaper interviews, and invitations to testify before local lawmakers. He had plenty of photo ops of him shaking hands with politicians who thought they were dealing with this courageous whistleblower, but in reality, they were dealing with a con man who treated nonprofits like his personal ATM. By 2012, the whole thing collapsed under lawsuits and debt. The Children's Crusade for Reform was dead, and Nicholas had already gotten what he wanted. Headlines, sympathy, and another layer of credibility that he could hide behind when the law eventually came knocking. So, by the mid-2010s, Nicholas had protective orders against him in at least 2 states. A long line of women had accused him of violence, coercive control, and threats. Former landlords accused him of fraud. Former colleagues accused him of lying and stealing. And in Ohio alone, he was sued more than a dozen times. Well, Nicholas Rossi was, anyway. But Nicholas had a gift. He could spin. To the politicians in Providence, Nicholas Alahverdian was this plucky survivor. To the press, he was a crusader, and to his victims, he was a con artist with a mean streak. In late 2017, Nicholas's third divorce was finalized. This woman sued his ass. But instead of paying up the $52,000 that he owed in the judgment, he jetted off to Ireland. Then he later moved to Essex, England. So he later moved to South Bristol, England sometime in 2019, and he found another unsuspecting woman to terrorize. This time it was a woman named Miranda Knight. He told her that he was from Dublin, and his name was Arthur Brown. If he was from Dublin, but had a terrible accent, did she not suspect? I don't know. So by late 2019, Nicholas's past was finally catching up with him, or Arthur at this point. So cold case DNA testing had expanded across the United States, and Utah prosecutors had run that long-stored rape kit through modern databases, and ding, 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 Nicholas Rossi was the match. Remember, his name was Nicholas Rossi when he lived in Utah. Hard to keep track, I know. Well, this DNA evidence directly linked him to this 2008 assault in Salt Lake County, and to that trail of civil judgments, fraud cases, and angry ex-wives, and Nicholas was cornered. Well, Arthur Brown was doing just fine. He and Miranda Knight actually got married in early 2020, and at this point, he actually took her last name, and he then became Arthur Knight. But Nicholas Alahverdian, or Nicholas Rossi, they were in trouble. So what did he do? Did he face the music? Did he lawyer up? Of course not. Nicholas did what Nicholas always did. He spun the biggest lie that he could think of. So in late February 2020, news broke that Nicholas Alahverdian, Children's Crusader, had died. An obituary was published in Rhode Island's local news outlets, including the Providence Journal, and it was something else. It claimed that Nicholas Alahverdian had succumbed to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at age 32. It said that he died peacefully, surrounded by family. Meanwhile, his family's looking around like,
What?
no, we weren't there. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? There was no death certificate, no medical record, no hospital confirmation. Just this wordy, suspiciously dramatic obituary that also claimed that his ashes had been scattered at sea. You know, that a memorial service had already been held, which is very convenient. So instead of a simple remembrance, the obituary read like a political resume and a revenge blog rolled into one. It highlighted his life's work as a child welfare reformer. It painted him as this martyr wronged by the state. It even praised his supposed valiant battle with illness, which, to be clear, no one outside of Nicholas had ever documented. You guys, this obituary read less like a death notice and more like a LinkedIn resume. The point is, it was definitely written about Nicholas by Nicholas. Get a load of this actual quote from it. At the bedside were Mrs. Alahverdian, their 2 children, and extended family. His last words were, "Fear not, and run toward the bliss of the sun." At the time of his passing, the room was filled with the sounds of the end credits for the 1997 film Contact by composer Alan Silvestri, a film and score which held special meaning for Mr. Alahverdian. Girl! Come on. Surrounded by Mrs. Alahverdian and their 2 children. They didn't have any children. Stop. Stop it. Filled with the sound of the end credits for Contact? You guys, I cannot.
I can't believe on my daughter's birthday.
Well, the investigators in Utah and Ohio were suspicious from the start. The timing of this was just like too convenient. Nicholas was suddenly dead from this long illness at the same time that his DNA was about to land him in prison. Well, the investigators tried to track down a death certificate, but there was nothing. They looked for hospital records, also nothing. It was like Nicholas had disappeared into thin air, which was exactly the point. Spoiler alert, he was definitely not dead. And for 2 years, he got away with it. The world thought that Nicholas Alahverdian, child crusader, was gone. So fast forward to 2021. Arthur and Miranda Knight, by this time, had moved to Glasgow, Scotland. He used a terrible English accent and he dyed his hair blonde. For somebody who was on the run, he was not subtle because Nicholas could not help himself. He had a pattern, he always needed to perform. And in December of 2021, in the middle of a global panini, his stage curtains finally fell when he landed in a Glasgow hospital. So Arthur Knight, at this point, he wasn't just any British bloke. He was this eccentric character who wore silk pajamas, puffed oxygen from a tank, and insisted that he was frail and gentle with this posh accent that sounded like Benedict Cumberbatch had been strangled by a bagpipe. It was so bad that one Scottish reporter described it as cartoonishly theatrical. So Arthur Knight is now in this Scottish hospital for COVID, right? And the hospital staff immediately noticed something was really off. His story didn't match his paperwork. His ID was non-existent. And then there were these tattoos. He had these very distinct tattoos, including one that said Delgado. And the nurses weren't stupid. They flagged it for police. The Scottish police ran his biometrics, the FBI compared fingerprints and DNA, and the results came back very clear. Arthur Knight was none other than Nicholas Rossi, aka Nicholas Alahverdian, the man who had supposedly died of cancer in Rhode Island in 2020. So extradition hearings kicked off, but Nicholas wasn't about to give up on this role. Once the police actually showed up to get him, he doubled down on this act.
Hi, I'm Arthur Knight, and this is my wife, Miranda Knight. And unfortunately, there are those who would claim differently.
Are you Nicholas Rossi?
No.
Are you
that is
Nicholas
completely
Alahverdian?
insane. Absolutely not.
You say you've never been to the United States?
Never in my life.
They claimed in court you were identified from tattoos.
That is not true.
This dude was something else. So Nicholas wheeled himself into court looking like an extra from Days of Our Lives. Silk pajamas, oxygen mask, wheelchair, the whole frail invalid shtick. He insisted that he was not Nicholas Rossi. He was Arthur Knight, a poor British man with health problems. And, you know, that accent I just did was probably better than what he was doing. He even dragged his new wife Miranda into it. She testified on his behalf, swearing that this was her husband Arthur, not some American rapist named Nicholas.
How can I be a flight risk if I can't even stand?
The electric wheelchair is not a prop. There's no faking of this illness.
So Arthur Knight wheeled dramatically into the courtroom with this oxygen mask and his silk jammies, claiming that he was like too frail to even stand up. But, you know, reporters later did catch him, you know, walking around outside without his wheelchair. So anyway.
Where is your scooter? Where is your scooter? Where is it?
He insisted on being addressed as Arthur Knight, poor innocent Brit, wrongfully accused. He shouted at judges in his fake accent, berating them for mistaken identity, and he was literally sitting there with the same tattoos that the FBI had on file for Nicholas Rossi. He claimed he was the victim of a vast conspiracy. The FBI, Interpol, and even at one point the Mormon Church were all supposedly out to get him, because when you're lying, you know, you go big. And then there were the lawsuits. So Nicholas threatened to sue anybody who dared call him Nicholas Rossi. Hospitals, newspapers, even the courts. He filed complaint after complaint, claiming defamation, mistreatment, and character assassination, while being the only person assassinating his own credibility. Here's the thing about lies. They're exhausting to maintain. Nicholas couldn't keep up his own details. He couldn't keep it straight. At one point, he claimed he had never even been to the United States. At another point, he admitted he might resemble Nicholas Rossi, but swore it wasn't him. Reporters covering the trial described the whole thing as a farce, you know, pantomime. But you know what? DNA doesn't care about accents, real or fake. Fingerprints don't care about your jammies. And science kept saying, this is Nicholas Rossi. This is Nicholas Alahverdian. This is the same guy. By 2023, and after endless appeals, Scotland finally said, enough is enough. The extradition was approved. Nicholas and his oxygen tank were put on a plane and shipped to Utah. Arthur Knight was gone. Long live Nicholas Rossi. By January of 2024, Scotland had finally called time on Nicholas's theater production. He was extradited to Utah, landing in Salt Lake County to face the charges that he had been running from since 2008. And the Arthur Knight Act didn't land.
He's gone to great lengths to hide his whereabouts, and he went to great lengths, I believe, to get out of the hospital in Scotland, so far as even trying to hire a private ambulance to be able to get away.
Nicholas was booked into jail, photographed, fingerprinted, and processed as Nicholas Rossi. Silk pajamas replaced with a standard issue jumpsuit. And suddenly the frail invalid looked a lot less frail. At his first U.S. hearings, he told the judges that he wasn't Rossi, he wasn't Alahverdian, he wasn't anyone except Arthur Knight. He claimed that the FBI had kidnapped him, his identity had been stolen, and Utah prosecutors were out to frame him. The jury was squinting. Before the rape trial could even kick off, Nicholas spent months dragging the court through identity hearings. He demanded time to prove that he wasn't Rossi or Alahverdian. But prosecutors stacked up fingerprints, DNA, and all these other documents that said otherwise. How do we know it's you?
I mean, look.
So at one point, he actually tried to represent himself, which always goes so well. He shouted at the judge in this fake British accent. He got scolded for being disruptive. And he eventually did back down and accept the court-appointed attorneys. Even his own lawyers admitted that this mistaken identity argument was pointless. By mid-2024, Nicholas abandoned this Arthur Knight defense. Instead, he pivoted to challenging the rape evidence itself, claiming that the survivor was confused or had reframed their encounter. It was the same manipulation tactic that he'd used his entire life, blame everybody else, deny, distract, and posture. The trial kicked off very recently, as I'm filming this. It was in August of 2025. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence from the 2008 rape kit, expert testimony confirming the DNA match, and the survivor herself, who bravely took the stand after 17 years to tell the jury what happened. Nicholas, meanwhile, declined to testify. He sat at the defense table looking smaller than ever. The Arthur Knight bluster had been stripped away, and his lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the survivor's memories had faded, and the state had taken too long to bring the case. The defense was that this was a sexual relationship that had soured, and this woman was just accusing him after trying to break things off. Well, the survivor pushed back hard. She told the jury that there was no relationship. This wasn't a breakup because they were never dating. They had only chatted briefly online and had met once in person. The prosecutor just cut through all the bullshit. You know, Nicholas's DNA was in that kit. He had spent years hiding, lying, even faking his own death to avoid justice. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was a case of a predator who thought he was untouchable. On August 13th, 2025, the jury returned a verdict quickly. He was guilty of first-degree rape. Nicholas Rossi, aka Nicholas Alahverdian, aka Arthur Knight, and on and on and on, was finally convicted. The sentencing is set for October 20th of this year, so there's a possible penalty of like 5 years to life in prison on the line. And this is kind of only the beginning because there's another trial set in Utah for a separate 2008 rape case. So we're gonna have to follow up on this one. So for years, Nicholas Alahverdian told anybody who would listen that he was a tragic hero, you know, a victim turned reformer, a fighter for justice. In court, stripped of his phony accent and this fake obituary, he was just another man caught by science and undone by his own lies. But here's the serious part. Behind all the jokes in the theater, there's real survivors who waited, you know, nearly 2 decades for justice. Nicholas spent those years manipulating, lying, and staging his own death to avoid accountability. The memes might be real funny, but the crimes are not. So Nicholas Alahverdian will go down in history not as a tragic hero, not as a crusader, not even as Arthur Knight, you know, pajama king of Scotland. He'll be remembered as a con artist, someone who thought he could outwit the world, but instead became a case study on how to not fake your own death. And that is the story of Nicholas Alahverdian. Huge thanks again to Nashi for sending me this dumpster fire of a story. You really came through. I mean, my makeup might be blended, but my soul is scarred. So if you like this episode, hit that subscribe button, throw me a like, share it with your most dramatic friend, you know, the one who would like fake an obituary to win an argument. You can also find links to all of the makeup that I used today down in the description box. And if you want to recommend a Crue Trime story to me, there's a link for that too. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! Murray has adopted a box. It is now his bed. And Debbie is trying to jump in the box with him, and he said, "No, thank you." Hello? Is it recording? Okay, what the fuck am I doing? So if you're into chaos... Children! Deborah, I need you to stop fucking with him. Ma'am? 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 She's a menace.